I've obviously recorded podcasts from reports on carbon capture and sequestration, carbon capture utilization and sequestration from different reports, and they all have slightly different opinions of how CCS, CCUS may or may not play a role in net zero and global warming targets. My own view is that it will be a inevitable part of the future, but I also worry that models are heavily relying on them for charting out future pathways to global warming targets. And I have podcasts on that as well, based on the social scientists arguing that integrated assessment models and model scenarios are overly relying on these non-existent technological promises. So this report from the Institute of Energy, Economy and Financial Analysis revisits this CCS, CCUS, but this time they do it by actually going through case studies of a large number of, or all the existing CCS, CCUS installations of certain scale, do financial analysis and argue that at this point it's not clear they are a part of the net zero goal, and in fact argue that this could be this could lead to what is called greenwash. You remember, whitewash is where you try to put gloss over inconvenient truths and unwanted unwelcome information about your organization or whatever. So greenwash is an equivalent of that, where you're trying to put a story that you are economically friendly and so on. So just starting with the globally implemented annual CCS CCUS projects by sector, this is fairly up to date here from this paper. CO2 sequestration, CO2 sequestered annually in million tons per year. So you can see that the projects are, CCS projects are split into proposed but not implemented and implemented. So here are the implemented ones. So you can see the zoomed in the implemented ones here in the power sector, other industrial sectors and gas processing. And you can immediately see that gas processing implementation of CCS, CCUS basically is either going into enhancing the recovery of oil and so on, or it's easier to capture them there, or that there are some emissions that are not reported well, like the scope 3 emissions, the burn that happens. So there is an effort now, there was an agreement under the UNFCCC to stop the leak of methane, for example, by 2030 and so on. So this tells you that there are ambitious plans made, but the implementation remains far behind. This is a conceptualization of the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration versus carbon capture and sequestration versus just carbon capture and utilization. We don't need to go into the details. We have looked at it elsewhere. Obviously, there is the carbon capture step, which can directly go into transport and storage, which would be CCS, and of the installed capacity, only about 27% is actually in this box, whereas the CCUS box occupies almost 73% of the total capacity that exists now. But this is where you have captured CO2 being used for enhanced oil recovery. So fossil fuel is removed, and unless there is a plan to phase these out towards net zero goals, this is obviously not a good way to do things, especially if CCS still takes a lot of energy. But these go for injection, re-injection and storage eventually, and argue that they are going to sequester more carbon than the fossil fuel they are extracting with carbon captured, but also that we need the fossil fuel to transition to renewable energy and so on. So there are lots of issues there. Of course, CCU, where the carbon captured is utilized for beverages, carbonates and greenhouses, is actually only less than 1% of the total capacity at this point. So here is the table showing the same thing. Share of CCUS versus CCS in capturing carbon, 50 years cumulative and 2021. So this is from the ExxonMobil report. So carbon capture type, enhanced oil recovery CCUS, dedicated storage CCS. So accumulated captured CO2 in million tons is over 50 years, is more than 240 million tons, so that's 80 to 90% of the total. Share of current 39 capture capacities is 73%, so that occupies most of it. This is dedicated CCS is less than 60 million tons, so 10 to 20%, total of 27% of capture capacity. A total is around 300, and this is the 100% total. So obviously you can compare these to the emissions gaps and the drawdown needed to head towards 1.5 or 2 degree C targets, especially the 2030 requirements, and you can easily see we are quite far away from actually being very effective in using CCS and CCUS to head towards global warming targets, let alone net zero. Overview of greenhouse gas protocol scopes and emissions across the value chain. Just wanted to make a point about scope 3 emissions, which the conclusions say, which we'll read next, that are not being reported accurately by companies, industries which report their carbon footprints and their CCS and CCUS, for example. So just simply, these are the greenhouse gases typically we look at. There is upstream activities that help the industry run its business, whether it's cement, steel, or whatever else. Could be iPhones, furniture, anything you can think of. So obviously there are direct emissions from the industry itself with company vehicles, which counts under its own emissions as scope 1 or direct emissions, whereas upstream you have purchased goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transportation and distribution, waste generated in operations, business travel of the company personnel, employee commuting, and leased assets. And there is of course purchased electricity, steam heating and cooling for own use as well. But the scope 3 downstream activities are not directly related to the industry, but it's part of their business, and they don't necessarily report these as accurately as they should or could. So transportation and distribution, often outsourced. Processing of sold products, often done by separate parties. Use of sold products, of course. End-of-life treatment of sold products. Leased assets, franchises, investments, and so on and so forth. So some companies like Apple are trying to look at the supply chains on both ends, strong wind there, and trying to include them in their net zero plans, but obviously those are exceptions rather than the rule. One point this report from IEEFA makes is that the cement industry is somehow different from all other applications of carbon capture technology, since CO2 is an inevitable byproduct of chemical reactions in cement production. Carbon capture technologies seem useful in this industry if they aren't used as an excuse to postpone other methods now under investigation to reinvent the processes and make cement production green. So there I have podcasts on reducing emissions from cement and steel, for example. So there are many ways being innovated to reduce these emissions. So simply saying CO2 is an inevitable byproduct and delaying those kind of transitions to greener cement would defeat the purpose of saying cement industry needs special treatment for CCUS for now. Okay, in all of these industrial applications, CCS, CCUS could be studied if it does not promote enhanced oil recovery, it does not extend or is used as an excuse to extend the life of any type of fossil asset. So this is very common to say simply there is no alternative right now and keep delaying, using delaying tactics. A safe storage location is identified and the long-term monitoring plan and compensation mechanism in case of failure are developed. The liability of the projects is not handed over to the taxpayers. So including the taxpayers in these process decisions and their risks and vulnerabilities and leakage possibilities, etc., have to be made open to the public. Finally, the conclusions they provide are these, with some details that I'm not including here. For example, they argue that green hydrogen has to become a bigger and bigger part of cement and overall renewable energy portfolio, but green hydrogen itself right now is not a fully realized process, in the sense that green hydrogen, which is supposed to not emit more CO2 to produce hydrogen, is obviously being used as a way out by the European Union, many industries and so on. But do we have economically viable life cycle analysis based actual green hydrogen yet? Not completely clear, but again, that's an inevitable requirement as we go forward. So further extrapolated in our conclusion at the end of this report, which I'm reading, we found failed and or underperforming projects considerably outnumbered successful experiences in CCS and CCUS. Successful CCUS exceptions mainly existed in the natural gas processing sector serving the fossil fuel industry, leading to further emissions. So there was not a net drawdown yet. The elephant in the room of the application of CCS, CCUS in the natural gas processing sector, Scope 3 emissions are still not being accounted for. So the downstream emissions, which are not directly related to the industry, are not owned up by the industry, saying somebody else has to account for that, for example. Captured carbon has mostly been used for enhanced oil recovery. Enhancing oil production is not a climate solution. This seems obvious, and the International Energy Agency, in its pathways for net zero by 2050, also emphasizes that EOR cannot be used as a legitimate use of CCS, CCUS unless there are plans to phase out fossil fuel systems and not just keep extending their lifetime or investing in newer fossil fuel industries. Okay, using carbon capture as a green light to extend the life of fossil fuel power plants is a significant financial and technical risk, and history confirms this. Some applications of CCS in industries where emissions are hard to abate, such as cement, could be studied as an interim partial solution with careful considerations. Okay, so reducing emissions from cement have to go forward, and there are of course environmentally friendly cement. Some people are claiming concrete that draws down cement, for example, and so on, but none of these have scaled up yet. So the main purpose of recording this podcast in the context of other podcasts we have on CCS, CCUS is that right now it's not clear CCS, CCUS is playing a positive role in taking us towards net zero, and this report emphasizes some of the points and says it has the potential to become a greenwash if we are not careful. Okay.